Okay, so today we're going to talk about the evolution and migration patterns of turf grasses. Now, when we talk about the evolution of turf grasses, what we're really talking about is the evolution of the grasses in general, not just turf grasses, because as we talked about, turf grasses are a relatively small subset of all the different grasses that exist in the world today. So when we think about the grasses in the primitive sense, there were two major groups, the BEP clade, which was comprised of the Bambusoideae, the Ehrhartoideae, and the Puideae. The Puideae is what gave rise to one of the major groups of turf grasses that we have today. The Bambusoideae, we might think that it sounds something like bamboo, and if you remember from one of the first lectures we talked about that bamboo is actually a grass. That's true. That's the family that gave rise to things like bamboo. The BEP clade of the B, E, and P of the Bambusoideae, the Ehrhartoideae, and the Puideae was one major group. And then there was the PACMAD group, the PACCMAD group, which was the Panacoideae, the Arundinoideae, the Chloroideae, the Centothicoideae, the Microaeroideae, the Aristoideae, and the Danthoideae. There's a whole host of grasses that we use today as turf grasses from this group. So these two groups together gave rise to the diversity of turf grasses that we have, that we use today. And so it's important to keep in mind that while we don't necessarily have to know exactly which ones of these grass groups are which or how to pronounce them, I stumbled through them, it's important to recognize that these were the two major groups that existed hundreds of millions of years ago as plants were beginning to evolve on the planet Earth. And these groups, particularly the Puideae, the Panacoideae, the Arundinoideae, the Chloroideae, and the Danthoideae, were groups that gave rise to some of our major turf grasses. And those groups are direct descendants of what we have today. The BEP group, and that's all we're going to talk about in terms of how we're not going to spend a bunch of time continuing to go over the names. The BEP clade gave rise to what we call the C3 grasses. And the C3 grasses, if you want to look it up online, C3 represents the type of photosynthesis that it does, involving a 3-carbon sugar. And they are often referred to as the cool season grasses. Cool season grasses have their optimal growth when temperatures are moderate. They come under stress when temperatures are extremely high or extremely low. This group developed about 10 million years earlier than the PACMAD group. So it's about 10 million years older. So there's that much more time, geologically speaking, for evolution to occur and adaptations to occur. The PACMAD group is composed of both C3 and C4 grasses. C4 grasses are what we call warm season grasses. Again, referring to the kind of sugar that's involved in photosynthesis, a C4, a 4-carbon molecule. And that this particular group, the C4 grasses, were mostly found in the Panacoideae, the Chloroideae, and the Aristoideae. So these groups gave rise to some of the modern day C4 grasses that we see in the world today, the warm season grasses. So when we talk about evolution and the evolution of the grasses, what we need to think about is that there's phases to that evolution. It's not like that just went from one kind of grass to another kind of grass and jumped across, but that there was a change that occurred over time. And that change is sometimes very sharp and distinct, and sometimes it's very gradual. And if you look at the scientific literature today, we find examples of that across the board when we talk about evolutionary biology. That there are sometimes sharp divisions that result in major changes to a group, and then at other times there's very subtle changes that are occurring as a result of adaptations that are making it more advantageous for the newer group to adapt and overcome something in their environment that they're experiencing. So in the evolutionary development of the grasses, we have a primitive center of origin, and then early diversification, then migration and dispersal out of that primary or primitive center of origin, which results in the development of secondary centers of origin. And there's generally multiple secondary centers of origin. And we'll talk about this in another lecture, I think in the next lecture, in fact. And this secondary center of origin development is really important to how grasses developed over time. The reason for that is that the primitive center of origin, for the most part, is not likely for us to know. And the reason why is that the primary center of origin, or the COO, has been wiped away because of major droughts, glaciation events, all kinds of other cataclysmic major events that occurred on Earth over the course of geologic history. Plate tectonics, the separating of continents, asteroid impacts, worldwide climate changes, all of those kinds of things that happen on a geologic timescale have basically erased, for the most part, our understanding of the primary centers of origin for many of our grasses. In combination with all of these events, the fact that there's a very poor fossil record of grasses, because they're relatively easily broken down compared to a lot of other plants, makes it extremely difficult for us to understand what happened during these different events. If we think about animals like the dinosaurs, we have a very good understanding of what happened during those different events because of the fossil record. Well, not having a fossil record makes it extraordinarily difficult to understand what's going on prior to some of these major geologic events. We do know that there were land connections, and that those land connections, or also we call them land bridges, were present during the early diversification of the grasses. So these land connections, where continents were still connected by a finger of land, an isthmus, or some bridge of earth from one point to the other, were critical in the early diversification and development of the grasses. Laurasia, as we talked about in previous lectures, in Gondwana, around 160 million years ago, there was a huge diversity of flora and fauna, so plants and animals, and the diversity on Gondwana. Laurasia, not as much according to the fossil record, but on Gondwana, there was a huge diversity. And so it's likely that the early migration events from these two locations were basically from Gondwana, and that those migrations out into other parts of Laurasia and then into the other continents as they started to separate, North America, South America, Africa, Asia, Europe, etc., were the result of migrations that occurred from the Gondwana major continent that existed 160 million years ago. When we talk about migration routes, as these multiple centers of origin existed and formed, the movement then spread out from those locations as well. So like I said, we don't have a real good idea of what was going on in terms of the primary center of origin, but as there were secondary centers of origin developing, as the grasses moved and spread and adapted to their environments, there was movement from those secondary locations to further spread them. And the major routes, or the routes that they took to move from one place to another, were basically wind, water, birds, animals, floating debris. There's also some evidence for oceanic island hopping, so birds or other animals or debris moving from one island, populating, spreading, moving from that island to the next, spreading, moving from that island to the next, and spreading. A common example of that are Darwin's finches that we talk about in basic biology and evolution in the Galapagos Islands. So this oceanic island hopping is believed to have been an important route, and it's generally thought that this route was suitable until the continents were approximately 750 miles apart. Right now, the Atlantic Ocean from Africa to South America is a couple thousand miles. So think about that being markedly closer. And then little islands that occurred in those areas as the continents spread apart and were ripped apart and volcanoes erupted, those islands would be suitable for jumping across. But now that the continents are spread apart, that oceanic island hopping is not nearly as accessible. Certainly in the Pacific Ocean, with the major island chains that exist and the Southeast Asia area, this is still thought to be a possibility today. So these migration routes form the major methods for how grasses transport themselves. And as we talk about in further lectures, we'll come back to some of these methods and we'll have class discussions about how these methods impact the movement of grasses, not just in geologic history, but in modern day history as well.